The courtroom was tense as Judge William Carter took his seat, his gaze sharp and commanding. He had seen countless defendants stand before him, and today was no different, or so he thought. Before him stood a middle-aged black woman, calm and composed, her hands neatly folded in front of her. To the judge, she looked like just another ordinary citizen caught in the wheels of the justice system. He barely glanced at her case file before making up his mind. With an air of authority, he prepared to deliver his judgment, convinced of her guilt. But what he didn't know, what no one in that room expected, was that this woman was far from ordinary. And within moments, the entire courtroom would be left in stunned silence when the truth was revealed. Judge Carter adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Ms. Johnson, you stand accused of trespassing and disorderly conduct. How do you plead?" The woman, still composed, met his gaze. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The judge barely concealed his skepticism. He had presided over enough cases to recognize when a defendant was stalling. "The evidence against you is clear," he said, glancing at the prosecutor, who nodded in agreement. "Witnesses claim you refused to leave private property when asked. You argued with security. Would you like to explain yourself?" The woman clasped her hands behind her back. "I would, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "But first, may I ask if you have read my full file?" Judge Carter frowned. "I don't see how that's relevant." The prosecutor, a young and eager man, stepped in. "Your Honor, if I may, this case is straightforward. Ms. Johnson was in a restricted area and—" "Restricted?" The woman's tone remained even, but there was an unmistakable firmness beneath it. "I was exactly where I was supposed to be." Judge Carter tapped his gavel lightly. "Ms. Johnson, I suggest you cooperate fully. If you continue to be evasive, I'll have no choice but to proceed with sentencing." A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. Something about the woman's confidence unsettled everyone. She took a slow breath before speaking again. "Your Honor, I understand your position, but before you make your ruling, I'd like to formally introduce myself." She turned slightly, her voice carrying across the silent room. "My name is Judge Eleanor Johnson, Senior Federal Judge of the United States Court of Appeals." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Carter's face went pale. The prosecutor nearly dropped his pen. The spectators exchanged shocked glances. The woman, Judge Eleanor Johnson, let the weight of her words settle before she spoke again. "Now, Your Honor, would you like to continue this case?" Judge Carter's grip tightened around his gavel. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. A federal judge? His mind raced. This had to be a mistake. He quickly glanced at the prosecutor, who looked equally stunned, rifling through his papers as if the answer might be buried somewhere in the documents. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. A reporter sitting near the back hastily scribbled notes. A few members of the jury exchanged wide-eyed glances. Carter finally found his voice, though it came out more strained than he intended. "You're claiming you're a federal judge?" Eleanor Johnson smiled faintly but didn't waver. "I'm not claiming anything, Your Honor. I am a federal judge. And if you had reviewed my full file, you would have known that before trying to pass judgment on me." The prosecutor, looking increasingly panicked, fumbled with his paperwork. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware. Eleanor turned to him. I imagine you weren't. Because if you had, you would have realized that I had every legal right to be where I was that day. She folded her arms. And you wouldn't have wasted the court's time with these charges. Judge Carter shifted in his seat. He was an experienced judge, yet he suddenly felt like a rookie who had walked into the wrong courtroom. His usual authority seemed to waver. He cleared his throat, reaching for any semblance of control. If what you're saying is true, then why are you here? Why not simply have this case dismissed beforehand? Eleanor's expression turned serious. Because this isn't just about me, she said, her voice now carrying a weight that made the entire courtroom fall silent again. It's about something much bigger, about how quickly people are judged based on assumptions rather than facts. She looked around the room, letting her words sink in. How often do people of color, especially black women, find themselves in this very position? Mistreated, disrespected, dismissed? I chose to let this process play out because I wanted everyone in this courtroom to see how easily injustice can happen, even to someone like me. Judge Carter's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him. He was known for being strict, for handing down harsh sentences when he felt they were deserved. But now, he was realizing that his own arrogance had led him into a situation he never expected. For the first time in a long time, he hesitated. Judge Carter, Eleanor prompted, her gaze steady. What's your ruling? The room was so quiet that the ticking of the courtroom clock seemed deafening. Everyone waited for what he would say next. Judge Carter exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His entire career had been built on the belief that he upheld justice, that his courtroom was a place of order and fairness. But now, standing before him was a woman who had just exposed how flawed the system truly was, and, by extension, how flawed he was. He picked up his gavel, but for the first time he wasn't sure how to use it. The prosecutor was still fumbling with his papers, clearly hoping to find a way out of the mess he had walked into. Eleanor Johnson, however, stood still, waiting. Not nervously, not pleading, just waiting. She had nothing to prove. Judge Carter licked his lips, then turned to the prosecutor. Do you have any objections to dismissing this case? His voice was quieter than before, stripped of the usual arrogance. The prosecutor's head snapped up. Your Honor, He stopped himself. What argument could he possibly make now? The evidence against Eleanor had been flimsy to begin with, but now that her true identity was known, it was outright indefensible. And no objections, Your Honor, he finally admitted, lowering his gaze. Judge Carter nodded, his grip tightening around his gavel once more. In that case, the charges against Judge Eleanor Johnson are hereby dismissed. He struck the gavel against the wooden block, the sound ringing loudly through the silent courtroom. But Eleanor didn't move. She didn't sigh in relief or thank him. Instead, she stepped forward, her presence filling the space between them. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but pointed. This is about more than just me walking free today. If I had been someone else, someone without my title, my status, would you have dismissed this case so quickly? Judge Carter stiffened. He could feel the heat of every pair of eyes in the room locked onto him. His reputation, his pride, everything inside him wanted to say something to justify himself. But what defense could he give? Eleanor continued, her voice steady. "I was accused of a crime I did not commit. And I was brought here because assumptions were made about me, because I looked like someone who didn't belong. That happens every day in courtrooms across this country. I had the power to fight it, but most people don't. And that's the real problem." Judge Carter opened his mouth, then closed it. She let the silence hang for a moment before shaking her head slightly. "You have a responsibility, Your Honor, not just to the law but to justice. Think about that the next time someone stands before you." With that, she turned, walking past the stunned prosecutor and out of the courtroom. As she stepped into the hallway, reporters swarmed toward her, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions. But Eleanor Johnson had said all she needed to say. Inside the courtroom, Judge Carter sat still, staring at the empty space where she had stood. For the first time in years, he wasn't certain if he was the one holding the power, or if he had just been taught a lesson he would never forget. Judge Carter remained seated, his fingers resting lightly on the gavel. The weight of Eleanor Johnson's words hung in the air like an unshakable presence. Around him, the courtroom was still stirring with murmurs. Some spectators whispering in disbelief, others nodding in silent agreement. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, gathering his documents with a speed that suggested he wanted to be anywhere but here. One of the court officers glanced at Carter for direction, but he simply waved a hand, signaling that court was adjourned. Still, he didn't move. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the door Eleanor had walked through moments before. He had spent years believing in the righteousness of his judgments, in his ability to discern truth from deception. Yet today he had nearly condemned an innocent woman based on assumptions alone. Worse, he had almost done so without a second thought. He exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Was this how it had always been? How many times had he sentenced someone unfairly without realizing it? How many people had stood before him, desperate to be heard, while he dismissed them with a flick of his gavel? His thoughts were interrupted by a court clerk stepping forward hesitantly. "Your Honor, you have another case scheduled." Judge Carter rubbed his temple. "Postpone it," he said, his voice quieter than usual. The clerk blinked in surprise but nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." As the clerk turned to leave, Carter reached for Eleanor Johnson's case file. He flipped through the pages, reading every detail he had neglected before. The arrest report, the incident summary, none of it held up under scrutiny. There had been no real crime. She had been accused for standing in the wrong place, for speaking when someone didn't want to listen. He sighed, closing the file. Then, in a rare moment of humility, he rose from his seat and stepped out of the courtroom. The hallway was still abuzz with reporters, their cameras flashing as Eleanor Johnson walked toward the exit, calm and composed. He could hear the questions they threw at her. "Judge Johnson, do you plan to take legal action? Will you speak publicly about what happened today? Do you believe racial bias played a role in your arrest?" She didn't respond to them, but when she noticed him approaching, she stopped. For the first time that day, Judge Carter truly looked at her. Not as a defendant, not as an adversary, but as someone who had just revealed an uncomfortable truth he could no longer ignore. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low but firm. The reporters immediately turned their cameras toward him, capturing the rare moment of a judge admitting fault. But Eleanor didn't look surprised. Instead, she simply studied him, as if deciding whether his words carried any real weight. "I know," she replied. A pause stretched between them. Then, she added, "The real question is, what are you going to do about it?" Carter had no immediate answer, but for the first time in a long time, he knew he needed to find one. Judge Carter stood in the hallway, surrounded by the hum of reporters and courthouse staff. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The weight of Eleanor Johnson's question lingered in his mind. What are you going to do about it? For years, he had prided himself on being a fair and decisive judge. Yet today, he had been confronted with a truth he couldn't ignore. Fairness was not just about following the law, but about questioning the very systems that enforced it. Eleanor held his gaze for a few seconds longer before giving him a small nod, one that wasn't quite forgiveness, but perhaps an acknowledgement that he had taken the first step toward change. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the courthouse doors. Carter watched as she stepped outside, where the midday sun bathed her in light. The crowd outside surged forward, their voices blending into a chaotic mix of questions and flashing cameras. But Eleanor Johnson walked straight ahead, undeterred, disappearing into the city beyond. Judge Carter remained still, staring after her long after she was gone. Finally, he turned and walked back into the courthouse, past the emptying benches, past the stunned faces of court officials who had never seen him second-guess himself. As he reached his chambers, he hesitated for just a moment before sitting down at his desk. He opened Eleanor Johnson's file once more, not because he had to, but because this time he wanted to understand. Then, slowly, he reached for another case file, one he had scheduled for the next day. For the first time in years, he wasn't just reviewing a case, he was re-examining everything he thought he knew. Change wouldn't happen overnight. He wasn't even sure how much of it was possible. But today he had been humbled. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward becoming the judge he had always believed himself to be. With that thought, he closed the file, took a deep breath, and prepared for the next case. Not as the judge he had been yesterday, but as the man he hoped to become tomorrow.